Good morning. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Registrar Corp's webinar entitled U.S. FDA Registration and Labeling Requirements for Winemakers. My name is Anna Benavente, and I am the Director of Registrar Corp's Product Labeling and Ingredient Review Department. Before we begin, I want to let you know that a recorded copy of this presentation will be sent to all registrants. We will end the presentation with a live question and answer session. If we run out of time, we are also happy to respond to your questions by email. You may submit a written question at any time during the webinar by using the Ask a Question feature in the top center of your webinar screen. Those, of course, will be answered at the end of the session. With that, I'd like to go ahead and begin. Here is a quick overview of what we will cover in today's webinar. We'll start off with the general requirements for any food product. So this is what you absolutely must do before you ship. Then we'll move into labeling. Labeling is generally the first thing that an inspector will see in port. So improper labeling can be a red flag to inspectors. Therefore, it's important to ensure that the labeling of your product is in conformance with the proper labeling regulations based on the agency that oversees your product. This red flag to inspectors can also indicate to them that there may be additional problems, which can result in delays in port and potentially a refusal of your product from entry. After labeling, we will move into the Certificate of Label Approval process, which is a specific requirement for certain wines. Then we will finish up with the question and answer session. Again, happy to answer any questions that you have regarding the information presented today. So we'll kick it off with the general requirements for food, talk a bit about jurisdiction, registration, prior notice, and then move into labeling. First and foremost, it's important to go over the jurisdiction of wine products. This is an important component and is essential to understanding how you should proceed before you export so that you can plan accordingly. Generally, the regulatory authority is granted to two federal agencies, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, TTB. There is one additional agency, the Internal Revenue Service, that has some impact, but we'll be covering FDA and TTB as they govern the labeling today. Generally speaking, the Food and Drug Administration and their policies will impact everybody, no matter the type of wine that you're producing. TTB is a little more limited in scope, and so it will be for specific beverages that you may be producing. First and foremost, we'll talk about the General Food Facility Registration. This is an FDA requirement. It's not particularly difficult, but it is important to make sure that it is done properly. This registration was implemented as a mandatory requirement after the 9/11 attack and the Bioterrorism Act of 2002. It requires that facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or store food, any food, including beverages and dietary supplements, must register with the FDA. So this will include any warehouse as well. Any foreign facility must designate a U.S. agent for communications with FDA. This U.S. agent must be someone physically located within the United States. The idea behind this being that FDA wants someone within the continental United States available to receive a notice of inspection or other communications rather than trying to contact the actual facility overseas. Choosing your U.S. agent is very important. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. If a U.S. agent doesn't properly accept the designation, it can jeopardize the registration. Part of the registration, which is a new requirement beginning in October 2020, is a unique facility identifier. At this point in time, the only one that FDA accepts is the DUNS number, the Dun & Bradstreet. This is a free service of the DUNS Group, but you should be aware that they will also be trying to sell you additional services when they give you the number. Again, you want to make sure that this is done properly. Errors in your registration can result in problems in port if the shipping documents don't match the registration information, for example. You will also want to ensure that the proper declaration of the type of products that you are producing is indicated. For example, we've had a few instances recently where companies erroneously marked that their products were dietary supplements instead of conventional foods and beverages. So when FDA came to inspect, they were conducting a dietary supplement inspection, which is much more rigorous than a conventional food and beverage inspection. So again, important that you are accurate when you indicate the types of products that the facility is producing. The information within the registration will include the name, the corporate entity type, the physical location of the site, and any trade names that are used, the contact information for somebody at the facility and the U.S. agent, and then again, the product information. You will want to ensure that this information is kept up to date. For example, if someone leaves the company that was the contact, you want to ensure your registration is current so that FDA has accurate information regarding who to contact at the facility as well as the U.S. agent. There are some exemptions, so these may not apply to the winemakers attending today, but important to reference. Trading companies, personal residences, farms, fishing vessels, USDA regulated products, these companies are exempted from the food facility registration requirement. Also important to note, the trading company should not actually be holding the food in order to claim the exemption. Again, any warehouses or entities that actually take possession of the food should register. It's also important to understand that there's a renewal requirement for your registration. So this is every 2 years, and it's critical. This is why it is good to have an alert and competent U.S. agent overseeing your registration. It is important to understand that failure to renew can result in a canceled registration. Now, while it is certainly possible to re-register practically immediately once you've discovered this, the number changes when you re-register. Your food facility registration number, they do not reinstate the old number. So if you have incorporated your food facility registration number into your shipping documents or the information that companies within your supply chain have, that can cause delays and disruptions in your supply chain if companies continue to use the old number. So the best thing to do, of course, is to make sure that that doesn't happen, because a failure to renew can result in an invalidated registration, which is technically a prohibited act under the law. And FDA purges the database. So if you ship with the old number, the customs entry information will not be accurate, and they may not let your products into port without the proper food facility registration, again, resulting in delays and disruptions to your supply chain. One additional prior notice requirement that you should be aware of is a notification to FDA that is required even for samples. This is in addition to the entry information that's filed with U.S. Customs. It is specific to FDA to notify them that a food shipment is on its way to the U.S. If it's not filed, this can result in a detention in port, until it is filed. It has to include information about the shipment and the facility. It can be filed by the exporter, the importer, or a third party. In fact, Registrar Corp has services related to prior notice, which many companies, particularly those that ship large quantities and numbers of shipments, can find helpful. Now that these are the baseline requirements that you will want to ensure that you have taken care of, we'll go ahead and move on to labeling. The first thing that you're going to want to determine is who actually is going to regulate the labeling on your products. And generally, this is how they divide it up. FDA handles wine and cider products that are less than 7% alcohol by volume. TTB regulates the labeling for those greater than or equal to 7%. It is kind of interesting. The reason that this is distinguished this way is based upon the definition of wine in our Federal Alcohol Administration Act. That act defines wine as products greater than or equal to 7% alcohol by volume. And because it gives TTB regulatory authority, wines that fall below that aren't part of their authority. And so they default into FDA jurisdiction. What's interesting, though, is that this same percentage doesn't actually apply to other types of alcoholic beverages. The same limits don't apply for distilled spirits or non-alcoholic beer, for example. Those all remain in TTB jurisdiction no matter the alcohol content. So this is sort of an interesting little detail for wines. And again, all the more important why you want to ensure that you determine which agency will regulate your labeling. So we'll start with the Food and Drug Administration labeling requirements. Now, if you have determined that FDA has jurisdiction over your product, this will be your plan for labeling. These are the mandatory declarations that you will need to ensure are on your label. You've got a statement of identity, which identifies the product, net quantity, a nutrition facts panel, an ingredients list, allergen statement, the manufacturer, distributor, or packer identity, country of origin, and a health warning statement. Unlike TTB, FDA is more particular about the placement and size of the mandatory declarations. And this is dependent on how FDA defines the different parts of the package. So, for example, you have the PDP, which is our principal display panel. And this is the panel that's most likely to be displayed on the retail shelf where a consumer sees it. Then you have an information panel, which is the panel immediately to the right of the PDP, unless that panel has is unusable in general, flaps, etc. There are some exemptions from that placement for smaller packaging where you can use any panel. Now, the statement of identity by regulation is the name that's specified by law, or the common or usual name, or a fanciful name understood by the general public. FDA says it must be reasonably related, that's the term that they use, to the largest text on the label, which oftentimes might be your logo. They don't actually define what they mean by reasonably related in regulation, but guidance from FDA suggests that half the size of the largest text on the label is reasonably related. It also must appear on the principal display panel. There are some special considerations when you have a low or non-alcoholic product. So a de-alcoholized wine should have de-alcoholized or alcohol removed preceding the term wine or the type of wine. So non-alcoholic or alcohol-free may be used in addition to one of those terms. So important to make sure that these appear on the label. They also should be followed by a statement contains less than 0.5% alcohol by volume, prominently displayed on the PDP in conjunction with that name of the product. And also, it cannot be used on products that have greater than 0.5% alcohol by volume. The next mandatory statement is the net quantity of contents. It is the amount of the product within the container, excluding the weight of the container itself. It's in terms of weight for solids, numerical count, or liquid measure, and it has to be in avoirdupois and metric measure on an FDA label. This actually doesn't apply to a TTB label, but if your wine has or is under FDA jurisdiction, you should include the amount in fluid ounces and in milliliters or liters on that PDP. It also has to appear in a minimum type size based on the size of the PDP. So you literally measure the size of it, and then that will dictate how large the type size of the net quantity is. Generally speaking, the bigger the container, the bigger that statement. Now, this is the most complicated part of an FDA label, our nutrition facts panel. Now, this is the new version that came out in 2016. So some of you may be familiar with the previous version that came out in 1990 and may still have it on your label. Now, this one has very different content and format. It's also based on the FDA's reference amount for that food. So, for example, you would not use this nutrition facts panel with the 100 milliliter serving size that is very common elsewhere in the world. The serving size stipulated by FDA for wine and wine coolers with less than 7% alcohol is 360 milliliters. That's going to be your serving size. Now you can see that this chart's pretty big. There's a lot of larger declarations. For example, our calorie count was made quite large with the new version. If you have smaller packaging, there are alternate formats that are also permitted for products with minimal nutrient value. So for example, wines may not have all those nutrients present and can use a different format. These are the alternate formats that FDA permits. So you can see the one on the top left is called our tabular chart, and it can be used on products that have less than 40 square inches of labeling space if the standard doesn't fit. On the bottom left, you'll see what we call our linear chart. It is a chart that goes on packages that are also less than 40 square inches where the tabular version will not fit. The chart to the right is what we call our simplified chart. This is a chart that's permitted when you have products where the nutrient values are insignificant for 8 or more nutrients. So for example, a wine might qualify for this because it has carbs and calories, but really no fat or sodium or protein or vitamins and minerals. So this is, for example, this is one that we often put on wine labels that are under FDA jurisdiction. A new requirement that came about in 2016 were dual column labels. And so FDA mandated this dual column for certain products. Where it impacts winemakers is that it is required for products in packaging that it has 200 to 300% of the reference amount. Again, that reference amount being 360 milliliters as the serving size. So this can impact 750 milliliter wine bottles because they fall within that 200 to 300% range. There are, however, some exemptions that exist from having to use the dual column. These depend on what FDA calls the available labeling space of the container. So for example, the necks and shoulders of bottles are not included in that calculation of available labeling space. And so if excluding those, your product has less than 40 square inches of labeling space, you may not have to use the dual column label. The next requirement is going to be the ingredients list. Now, this is, as well as the nutrition facts panel, this is a big departure from the requirements for TTB regulated wines. FDA requires an ingredients list that must declare every ingredient by its common or usual name. That means no E-numbers. E-numbers, of course, the codes that are used for certain food additives and colors in the European Union and elsewhere in the world, those are not permitted to be used on FDA-regulated product labels. It has to be declared by its common or usual name. They also have to be in descending order by weight. And if you have an ingredient that in and of itself has more than one ingredient, those sub-ingredients must be declared in parentheses after the name of the ingredient. Also important to understand that most ingredients, even if they share a function like a thickener or a color, cannot be grouped together. So for example, if you had a cider of sorts that had colors added to it, you would not be able to just group all your colors together in parentheses within the list. Now, there are some additional requirements for colors and flavors. Generally, natural flavors can be declared simply as natural flavor. Artificial flavors can be declared as artificial flavors, but you cannot call something a nature identical color or flavor, sorry. And so those are considered artificial flavors by FDA because they're synthetic. Also, certain colors, for example, Allura Red and Tartrazine, are required to go through a batch certification process with FDA before they can be used in a product destined for the United States. So if you're using a color that's subject to batch certification, important to get that done before you incorporate it into the product. The ingredients are also subject to FDA food additive regulation, and also sulfites must be declared in the ingredients list if they're greater than 10 parts per million. At that level, they fall out of the normal exemption FDA has for processing aids. The next thing that we have is the allergen statement. This is based on the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act, which is a declaration of any ingredient that is a major food allergen. Now, FDA's list of major food allergen is very different than in other countries. So you can see them all listed there. You'll note that, for example, mustard and rye and sesame are not listed. So those are not to be included in our allergen statement declarations. FDA actually has taken action against companies that do. Even if it's well-intentioned, it's still in violation of the FDA's regulation for allergen. Now, many companies want to be able to indicate if an allergen might be present in terms of cross-contamination. This is called advisory labeling and is voluntary. The actual allergens that are ingredients are the ones that are declared under this act and should be indicated either in the ingredients list or by use of a contains allergen statement that is typically put adjacent to the ingredients list. Also important to understand that it is voluntary for TTB regulated beverage. This is because the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act modified and amended our Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which impacts FDA-regulated products. It did not modify or amend the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, which governs TTB and the products that they oversee. The next statement that will appear is your manufacturer, distributor, or packer information. Companies may use any of the three at their own discretion. If a company is named on the label that is not the actual manufacturer, such as a distributor or a packer, they should indicate that with a qualifying phrase, such as manufactured for or distributed by. The regulation states that a full address must be given, no P.O. boxes, but the street address can be omitted if it's found in a local or city directory. And this simply is because FDA wants to be able to find the company if in the event there's some sort of issue with the product. They want to be able to easily find the company so that it can be rectified. Now, country of origin, we mention even though it's not an FDA requirement because it has to appear on every article of foreign origin according to our U.S. Customs and Border Protection regulations. So this statement must be in English, and by definition, it is the country where the last substantial transformation took place. So, for example, if you have grape juice that was grown in Chile, grapes that are grown in Chile, but then it's processed and fermented in Argentina, the country of origin may be Argentina, not Chile, even though Chile is where the grapes were grown. Finally, we have the health warning statement. This is required on all alcoholic beverages that have greater than 0.5% alcohol, no matter if they're FDA or TTB. They are minimum type size based on the container size, and they can appear on the front, back, or side of the container. You can see the text of the government warning below. This is exactly how it should be presented, with the government warning in boldface type. It should not be supplemented with warning statements or symbols from the home country. We have seen TTB and FDA take issue with additional statements. This is the only one that should appear. This is a lot of information to fit on a label for sure. If you determine that your product is under TTB jurisdiction for labeling, it's not quite as onerous. So this would be your plan of attack when it comes to labeling your TTB regulated wine. These are the mandatory declarations that you'll have. Instead of a PDP and an information panel, TTB talks about a brand label and then a back label or an other label. On the brand labels, you're going to have the brand name, the class and type of the wine, and then the percentage of domestic wine if you've got a blend of domestic and imported wines. Now, anywhere on the label, including the back label, can appear certain names and addresses depending on the origin of the wine, the net content, alcohol content, country of origin, certain ingredient disclosures, the health warning statement, and the country of origin. Now, the brand name is usually the most prominent statement, of course. It's the branding of your product, and it's on the front of the container. Generally, it's the name under which the beverage is marketed and has to be truthful and not misleading regarding the nature of it. It can be a non-English statement. The one case, though, where you should be very careful is if you're referencing a country or an area where that is not the origin of the product itself. So in those types of cases, you might need to qualify it with the word brand. So for example, if you had a wine and the brand mentions Japan, but the wine is not from Japan, you would want to say, Japan Gold brand, and then a truthful and not misleading statement regarding the identity of the wine itself. Now, the class and type designation. Naming wines can get very complex. This is the text of just the first part of the regulation that stipulates how class and type are to be determined. So you'll want to be very, very careful and make sure you've done your research. We'll give you some general guidelines in this webinar, but you're always welcome to reach out if you have additional questions regarding the class and type of your wine. It can get very tricky. Now, the class and type designation generally is the specific identity of the wine, and they have established what are called standards of identity for certain classes and types of wine. So, for example, you have grape wine, citrus wine, rice wine, dessert wine, aperitif as classes and types for different types of wine. The class is required with some exemptions. If you name a product as a table or dessert wine, you don't need to include these other terms in the name. Other designations can be used instead of class. For example, if you have champagne, which is considered a sparkling grape wine, you don't have to include sparkling grape wine. Champagne all by itself will suffice. Um, Sometimes, though, you will have to have an adequate statement of composition if there's not a class definition for your product. So, for example, if you have a table wine that you've added natural flavors to, then you'll need to go ahead and qualify that as a table wine with natural flavors, because it doesn't conform to the standard of identity for quote unquote table wine. Okay. Another part of the label that's often added is an appellation of origin. Of course, many wineries are very proud of, the vineyards in which the grapes are grown and the origin of the wine itself. And so this is a statement of the place of the true origin of the wine. So, for example, Napa Valley, Chilean, American wine. Sometimes people will list multiple countries, counties, or states. Again, for marketing reasons and to convey the quality of the wine, they might want to highlight that. The appellation of origin is required if a grape variety is declared or a type of varietal significance, such as a muscadine grape, is referenced, or if you have a semi-generic type, such as champagne. You also have to have an appellation of origin if the product name is qualified by the word brand. As I mentioned before, if you've got a geographic reference in your brand that's not true to origin, you're going to want to have the accurate appellation of origin included in your labeling. Also, if you've got a vintage wine or you're making a certain claim about the year of harvest, or if it's estate bottled. Now, often it's desirable for marketing reasons, certainly, to indicate the grape variety on the label of the wine. It is optional, though, for any grape wine. But again, it's often used because certainly wine drinkers like myself have our favorites. You can only use, though, approved variety names. So for a domestic wine, that would be a variety name that's been approved by the administrator of the TTB. For imported wines, generally speaking, you can use variety names that are approved by the country of origin. You can also list either a single or a multiple grape variety on the label, and there are specific requirements depending on how many you name and certain exemptions for each one. Now, TTB is actually more specific regarding the declaration of the company name and address than FDA is. Again, FDA allows you to put either the manufacturer, bottler, distributor, packer, pretty much anybody on the label, as long as they have a direct relationship with the product. However, for TTB, because alcoholic beverages that are TTB regulated are more tightly controlled in the United States, they specifically want the importer named on the labeling. So on imported products, you should have the importer information is required. And if it's actually bottled and packed in the US, then that entity should appear on the label as well. For domestic companies, the requirement is that the bottler or packer appear on the label. Now, however the entity is presented, it should be preceded by a statement that explains the relationship. So bottled by or imported by needs to be referenced as well. Now, the net contents is regulated differently by TTB than by FDA. For example, FDA doesn't have any specific restrictions on the volume of the wines under its jurisdiction. TTB is different. TTB has standards of fill for most of the alcoholic beverages that they oversee. For wines, it has to be packaged in one of these volumes. Now, it is important to let you know that there has been a proposal to get rid of the standards of fill, but it is not final as of yet. And so until it is, wines will still be subject to these standards of fill. So you'll want to make sure that it's packaged in one of these volumes before it's sent to the United States. TTB expects it to be stated in milliliters, and it may also be stated in US measure, so the fluid ounces, for example. Generally speaking, I would say most wines that are under TTB jurisdiction simply state it, the amount in either milliliters or liters. You don't often see fluid ounces referenced on these products. The placement can vary. So it is required on the front label if the container holds an amount other than one of the above standards of fill, which would be greater than 3 liters, which is wholesale and generally subject to different requirements. Other than that, it's allowed on any label. And it's not required on the label if it's permanently marked on the bottle. So for example, if you have a bottle that is embossed with 750 milliliters, that will suffice. Alcohol content should be declared. It is required for the wines that have greater than 14% alcohol. It is optional, though, for wines that are between 7 and 14% if they are labeled as a table or a light wine on the brand label. TTB and American consumers expect a table wine to be between those percentages. Now, it should be expressed as alcohol by volume, either specific percentage or as a range. And depending on the alcohol content, there's a certain range, 0.5, 1% that TTB gives that can be allowed to be presented on the label. I would say, generally speaking, most companies will express a single percent rather than a range, but it is permitted in certain cases. Now, as I mentioned, the mandatory ingredient disclosures, TTB does not actually require a full ingredients list except in certain instances. The ingredient disclosures, though, that have to be made would be if you have sulfites that are greater than 10 parts per million, you should declare contains sulfites or contains a sulfiting agent on the packaging. If you are using aspartame, there's a special warning you see for phenylalanine that must be declared. Also for FD&C yellow number 5, which is the batch certified version of tartrazine. Also for cochineal or carmine, if it's used as a colorant in your product, then you see the statements that should be included in the labeling. And this is because there are some people that have allergic reactions to this colorant. People that have an allergy to crustacean shellfish sometimes are sensitive to cochineal extract and carmine, so that has to be put on the label. Then also if saccharin is used, the cancer warning that comes with saccharin should be on the labeling. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so organic claims. We're seeing a growth of the organic industry, certainly. And this it's also had effects on winemakers and wine consumers as well. Organic claims can be made if it conforms to the requirements of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They oversee organic claims, even if it's on FDA or TTB regulated products. So these regulations provide standards for the production and handling and labeling and processing of products that make that organic claim. There are 3 general claims that can be made: 100% organic, or made with organic ingredients. And there are certain percentages that must be met in terms of the composition of the product to make each claim. Now, these apply to any agricultural product, so that includes alcoholic beverages. And so TTB and FDA actually have signed memorandums of understanding with USDA. They work with USDA to ensure that the regulations that have been promulgated by USDA, that the alcohol beverage industry under both agencies are aware and are conforming to it. Particularly for wines that have sulfites added, this is going to impact their organic claims. So you will want to ensure that you have a competent certifying authority for any organic claim that's made on your label. Now, the U.S. also has memorandums of understanding with other regions. So, for example, the European Union and Canada products that are certified in their home countries can automatically be marketed as organic here. Now, there are some prohibited labeling statements. For example, if you have false or misleading statements on your labeling, or if you've made some sort of disparaging remark towards your competitor's product, that's not permitted at all. Clearly obscene or indecent statements are not going to make TTB very happy, or guarantees that are deemed to be misleading. You also have to be careful with trade or brand names that imply a false endorsement, either by your home country or the US government, or even a celebrity. Like, for example, I believe Greg Norman has wine and it's used with his permission. But if you just decide that Kim Kardashian is going to be the brand name for your wine, she may take issue with that, and TTB may take issue with that as well. Also, any statements that create the impression that the wine has intoxicating qualities. If your brand name is Drunk Fast, this could cause issues with TTB and the labeling of your wine product. So this is sort of an example of what a typical wine label might look like. We've got some mandatory, but also some voluntary labeling statements here. But just to give you an idea of how it could be presented if you had one single label. Now, if you had a brand and a back label, many of these statements could then appear on the back label as well. And that's how it's commonly presented on wine labels in the United States. Now, as you can probably tell, the TTB labeling is not as complex as FDA labeling, but they do have an additional requirement that FDA does not have. This is the Certificate of Label Approval. Now, FDA wines are not subject to any label approval process. TTB regulated wines, though, are subject to the label approval requirement, where labels are submitted to TTB and have to be approved prior to distribution of the product. In fact, they won't even let it be removed from the customs warehouse unless you have that COLA, as we call it, for each unique product and label. So it's important to make sure that that has been approved and you've gone through that process before you start shipping. Your importers won't be allowed to remove it, and I can promise you they won't, because if they do, they face huge penalties from TTB and the US government. It's also important to determine if your product is subject to a pre-COLA review. Now, this is a review process in advance of the regular COLA process that is required for certain types of products. So, in essence, your more unusual wines may be subject to this. Cabernet Sauvignon, not so much, but an Asian plum wine, hemp wine, sake, unusual wines might have this requirement. Now, it can include either a laboratory analysis that TTB will conduct on the wine, or a formula approval. Now, TTB does have an online system that is very helpful to submit information and the forms that are necessary to get the approval prior to the submission of the COLA. The COLA process is a process by which the labels are submitted with this specific form, 5100.31, to the TTB. Again, they have an electronic process for this as well, which is a pretty good system. It gives you estimates in real time, tells you how far into their backlog they are, when you can expect to hear back from them. So it's actually pretty user-friendly and bottler-friendly as well. What happens is TTB has 90 days to review and then can take an additional 90 days under unusual circumstances. Any pre-COLA review approval, the formula or the sample, the label analysis, or the laboratory analysis has to be part of this COLA process. So you absolutely do that first and then come into the COLA process. Now, agency will return labels that they deem unacceptable. The label is part of this process, again, of course. We had an interesting case last year that a company came to us because they had submitted their wine labels. One was a wine that was at 7.1% alcohol. The other one was at 6.9% alcohol. And the 6.9% alcohol was returned because it was technically under FDA jurisdiction. So they really do take that 7% very seriously. If it's slightly under it, it will fall into FDA jurisdiction. Now, there is no fee to apply for the COLA, which is helpful. Once you have your COLA, you are allowed to make certain revisions to the labeling without having to resubmit and go through the whole process again. So these are some of the changes that you can make without having to worry about getting a new COLA. So certain design elements, if you change, for example, if you changed your logo a little bit, or you decided to add the crest of the estate where it was bottled, certain design changes like that won't necessitate a new COLA. Certain statements can be still revised just as long as you're not all of a sudden in violation of the applicable regulations. Adding things like recycling symbols, bottle deposit values, and so forth won't necessitate a new COLA. Now, while this is somewhat of an onerous process, I will tell you that it actually can be very handy because you will know without question that your label is fine. Because FDA does not actually approve labels, oftentimes companies don't find out there's a problem until they've shipped and the product is in port and the inspector is taking an issue with the label. So it's important for an FDA regulated product that you be very careful to ensure that your labeling is correct. TTB, it's nice because if they return the label to you and they don't accept it and give you the COLA, they will tell you what's wrong. So then you can fix it and resubmit. Okay. Now, if you decide that you actually need help with any of the requirements that we've discussed, you can see we have a lot of services that are related to these FDA and TTB requirements. We have services to help with registration and renewal. We serve as a U.S. agent for almost 20,000 companies that are required to have the U.S. agent under the food facility registration. We do prior notice filings, and we have labeling and ingredient review services for both TTB and FDA regulated products. And then we also offer a TTB wine labeling guide for companies that want to do it on their own. This can guide you through all the processes that we've discussed today. Also, webinar registrants will get 10% off any of these services for the next month. Simply reference the webinar, and we'll also send you information and a promo code in the email that follows this webinar to every registrant. Now, before we get to the questions and answers, I'd like to announce again that we will be sending a recorded copy of this webinar and a PDF copy of the presentation to all registrants. Again, you may submit a written question at any time by using the Ask a Question feature at the top center of the webinar screen. So we'll go ahead and get started. I see we have some questions that have been submitted. Okay, so some people were asking about sending the presentation. You absolutely will be able to receive it. We'll send it out to everyone. There's a good question about sending samples to a potential importer. Should we or them register the label and back label to get the COLA? So products, if you're sending a sample, either as to a potential buyer or for a trade show or for a lab analysis, there is a waiver that the TTB can grant you so that you do not have to go through the entire COLA process. So that's a very important way to get those samples in to potential buyers in a timely fashion. You can find information on the TTB website regarding this process. Also, you're welcome to contact us directly, and we can provide you that information by email as well. Okay, let's see, we'll get to our next question. Should we add the nutrition fact back label in wines of 12.5% alcohol in the regular 750 milliliter size and in the Magnum 1.5 liter size? So for 12.5% alcohol, if that is the level of your wine, you are not subject to the nutrition facts panel. Many years ago, the TTB did propose a sort of a nutrition facts label that they called serving facts, but that has not been finalized. And so honestly, I think they may have just sort of left it by the wayside rather than deciding to actually implement it, because it's been quite a few years since that was proposed. So at this point in time, no nutrition facts are required on a TTB wine, and that would include a wine with 12.5% alcohol. Okay, let's see. Okay, question, should we put the percentage of each grape wine we use in a blend? So the breakdown for the single variety and the multiple varieties, the percentage is not necessarily required. Generally speaking, if you have a single variety wine, the single variety should constitute 75% of the formulation, and all the grapes in that product should have been grown in the appellation of origin. Now, if you have a multiple variety wine, all grapes that are used in the wine should be listed. But generally speaking, there's no percentage requirement except in certain cases. Now, question, does the COLA have to be presented by the U.S. agent, or can it be presented also by the producer? The COLA can be presented by the producer. We have found that TTB is very responsive. They're a smaller agency than the FDA, and so they're much more responsive when you reach out to them. And so they can also answer lots of questions if you have any about the COLA process. See, we have a question regarding 14 percentage plus wines. Does it have to appear on the invoice and on the COLA? So the certificate of label approval will prompt you for certain information. I do believe that the percent alcohol by volume is part of that process, simply because the TTB wants to have good information about the nature of the alcoholic beverage for which the label is being approved. Let's see. Okay, there's a question about some placeholder fields, whether those can be used to declare on a COLA, such as the vintage. We would recommend, to expedite your process, that placeholders not be part of the COLA submission, simply because that is the label that has to appear on the alcoholic beverage when it's shipped to the United States. So there's no formal statement from TTB about this, but I would say the odds are that placeholders may not be accepted when TTB does the COLA approval process. So there's a question about the European sign of the pregnant woman, regarding, pregnant women should not consume alcohol. We would strongly recommend that not appear on the label approval. We have seen an instance where a company submitted a label approval and it was not accepted because of foreign symbols, of this type were part of the labeling. And so we would strongly recommend that you simply put the government warning that TTB requires. Okay, let's see, the DUNS number is a new requirement. How do we apply for one? You can contact DUNS directly. For companies that are using Registrar Corp's registration services, we actually contact DUNS on their behalf. You usually can get it within a couple of days. And again, it's going to be a mandatory element of the food facility registration here soon. Okay. Question, do you have more details about how to register organic wines? My suggestion here would be to find an organic certifying agent that's recognized in your home country and then also by our USDA. EcoCert, for example, is a very common one that we see on labels. You want to make sure that whatever agent you use, they can verify that they are a recognized agent under both of your home country and the US. A question, how do we know if a specific wine or spirit needs a special formula? So the TTB information online has huge tables that go into great detail about every single type and whether or not it has to have a laboratory analysis or whether it has to have any other sort of pre-COLA submission. You can also reach out to us and we can try and determine that for you as well. Okay, let's see. We've got some other questions about the possible to know a little bit more about Dunn's. Again, it's Dun & Bradstreet is the company. I believe they're a credit agent type agency doing business credit type services. And so they established Dunn's numbers under their business, and you can get one for no cost. Okay. Let's see, we've got questions about in what format must the labels be submitted for COLA approval? The graphic file itself should be part of the submission. You should make sure that it's very clear and that the TTB agents will be able to read all of the information that's on the label. Let's see, what other questions we have? Is there any office where we can submit a label under FDA regulation? Unfortunately, no. The volume of products that the FDA oversees is so large that they simply don't have any sort of way to give you guidance, either formal or informal, regarding the content of your labeling. That's how Registrar Corp actually ended up coming up with our label and ingredient review services, because FDA simply expects you to go through their thousands of pages of guidance documents and regulations and implement it on your label. And so, unfortunately, they're very unsympathetic when products come into port that don't have proper labeling. They can refuse them entry or delay and force the importer to relabel the product before they will release it. So you will want to make sure that your product labels are in compliance before you ship. Question, is there any estimation when the restrictions on volume size from TTB will be eliminated? Unfortunately, there's really no way to know. They submit the proposed rule through what's called our Federal Register. So that's where we see it as industry and consumers, but they don't give, generally speaking, any sort of estimate as to when we can expect the final rule. Certainly not one that you want to plan your business around. Okay, so there are some questions about tariffs and those sorts of things. Registrar Corp is not a customs brokerage firm, and so the best that I can tell you is to make sure that your customs broker is competent and helpful, and they can guide you through the whole tariff classification process and ensuring that everything is appropriately done on that side. Okay. Okay. Oh, there's a question regarding a webinar regarding spirits. I certainly haven't planned on one yet, but if there's interest, we will be more than happy to produce a webinar in the coming year regarding distilled spirits. If there's enough interest, people definitely should let us know. Okay, let's see. We have time for maybe one more question. Let's see. Question is, can we use an importer sticker with the relevant information on it? So that's going to depend pretty heavily on whether you're talking about a TTB regulated wine or an FDA regulated wine. Because TTB labels are approved, generally speaking, it's probably best to go ahead and produce that sticker, go through the approval process, and then apply it directly to the bottle and not try and cover up other information. Now, for TTB regulated products, because there's no label approval process, and a lot of times people are sending the products based on the immediate demand in the United States, it is common for companies to cover old labels with an FDA compliant label. This can be acceptable. I would caution you to cover up all non-compliant information because if any of it is showing through, then the FDA inspectors can decide that the product is misbranded and not let it in through port. You'll also want to make sure that all of the placement requirements are adhered to and that the stickers are firmly attached so that they will not come off in transit. Okay. Well, we are out of time, but you are welcome to send us additional questions anytime by email to info@registrarcorp.com. You will want to reference this webinar, and the people that will receive the information will pass it along immediately to me. I will be more than happy to answer any questions that I can by email. This concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today.